In 1790, soon after the Constitution was ratified, the first census was taken of our new nation. According to the census, there were fewer than 4 million Americans, most of whom lived along the Atlantic coast. Now, almost 40 years have passed. 40 important years of change and growth. The United States has doubled in size and tripled in population. The original union of 13 states has been joined by 11 new states, most of them in the West, where settlers are attracted by plentiful land and the opportunity to make a fresh start. Along the Ohio River, towns have sprung up as stopping places for covered wagons and river boats. The people of this fast-growing region think of themselves as Westerners with their own special needs and interests. Meanwhile, new factories in the Northeast have brought about an important change in this older section of the country. The northeastern states are now the center of American manufacturing. In the southern states, on the other hand, cotton plantations have spread over thousands of acres of land. Many more Southerners now depend on cotton for a living. In 1828, the West, the South, and the Northeast still had much in common, but the differences among the three sections were widening. For example, factory owners in the Northeast claimed that higher tariffs were needed to raise the price of goods imported from foreign countries. Otherwise, cheap foreign goods would put American manufacturers out of business. To Southerners, however, higher tariffs simply meant higher prices. There were few factories in the South, so Southerners had to buy most of their manufactured goods either from Europe or from the North. Westerners wanted tariffs to protect some of their own products, such as wool and hemp, from foreign competition. They also hoped that high tariffs would bring in more money to the federal government. Then the government would be able to sell Western lands at a lower price and build roads and canals. By 1828, there were enough Northern and Western congressmen who favored tariffs to pass an act setting up the highest tariff rates up to that time. The majority must rule, they said. But Southerners felt that they had their rights, even if they were in a minority. They would be robbed by this high tariff, and their foreign trade would be harmed. Foreign trade had long flowed into the port of Charleston, South Carolina, and it was the people of South Carolina who would lead the protest against the tariff of 1828. During the American Revolution, South Carolina patriots had raised their own flag and bravely fought for their rights against the British government. Now the South Carolina legislature declared that the federal government had no right to pass a law which favored another section of the country at the expense of their state. The idea of states' rights had been ably stated by John C. Calhoun, South Carolina's leading spokesman. Now Vice President of the United States, Calhoun presided over the Senate in Washington, and it was here that the question raised by South Carolina was first debated. Because he was the presiding officer, Calhoun himself could not speak. The spotlight fell instead on Senator Robert Hayne of South Carolina. He claimed that states had the right to protect themselves against unconstitutional laws passed by Congress. On the day Hayne spoke, Senator Daniel Webster of Massachusetts recalled,
I had left the court pretty late in the day, and went into the Senate with my court papers under my arm just to see what was passing. It so happened that Mr. Hayne very soon rose in his first speech. I did not like it, and my friends liked it less.
When the word spread that Daniel Webster would answer Senator Hayne, people clamored for admission to the Senate to hear the Union's most famous orator. Wearing their best dresses, the ladies of Washington crowded the Senate balcony reserved for visitors. When there were no more balcony seats, senators gallantly surrendered their own chairs to the spectators. Webster spoke. Hayne replied. Then back and forth for almost 2 weeks, the two senators debated what kind of union had been established by the Constitution. Had the states given up their independence when they joined the Union? Or had they kept freedom of action, perhaps even the freedom to leave the Union? This question had come up before, when states had felt their interests were threatened by the acts of the federal government. Now, a showdown was fast approaching. Senator Hayne spoke bitterly.
The senator from Massachusetts has attempted to ridicule the idea that a state has any constitutional remedy against a deliberate violation of the Constitution.
Webster saw what Hayne's argument could lead to.
I understand the senator from South Carolina to maintain that the states may lawfully decide, each state for itself, whether in a given case the act of the general government transcends its powers.
Not according to the Constitution, said Webster. Its words clearly stated that federal laws were superior to those of the states.
I myself do not admit that under the Constitution there is any way in which a state government can interfere and stop the progress of the general government by force of her own laws, under any circumstances whatever. God grant that in my day may I not see the broken and dishonored fragments of a once glorious union, a land rent with civil feuds or drenched in fraternal blood. Not liberty first and union afterwards, but that other sentiment dear to every true American heart, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable.
As the debates ended in the Senate, Americans shifted their attention to the White House and to the man who was then president, Andrew Jackson. What, they wondered, would President Jackson do? Jackson was a strong president, so strong, in fact, that a cartoon attacked him as King Andrew I. Defiance of the authority of the federal government was also a challenge to Andrew Jackson, its president. Never in the past had he let a challenge go by. Jackson had been a fighter and a patriot since he was a boy during the Revolution, and had boldly refused to polish the boots of a British officer. He still bore the scars of that encounter. As a general in the army, he had fought many other battles in defense of the country he loved, the most famous of all at New Orleans. Now, Jackson wanted the United States to expand westward to the Pacific. Unless the country remained strong and united, this was not likely to happen. On the other hand, Jackson's home in Tennessee was a large cotton plantation, and he was a Southerner by birth. The votes of the Southern states had helped elect Jackson president in 1828. Furthermore, he was a Democrat, and the Democratic Party generally favored states' rights. Perhaps Jackson would sympathize with South Carolina. If you had been living at this crucial time, how do you think Jackson would have reacted? What could Jackson do if South Carolina defied the federal government? What were the arguments for and against states' rights? What might influence Jackson's decision? Let's stop for a moment and discuss these questions, just as they were discussed throughout the United States in the 1830s. Time passed, but still there was no word from the White House. Soon a dinner would be held in memory of Thomas Jefferson, founder of the Democratic Party. A group of Democrats who favored South Carolina's stand decided that the dinner would provide a good opportunity to force President Jackson to support their side. They drew up a series of toasts to be given at the Jefferson Day dinner, all of them so worded as to favor states' rights. When the time came for the president to make his own toast, the states' writers hoped that he would go along with the spirit of the occasion rather than upset this important gathering of his own party. At the dinner, encouraging applause greeted Jackson when he stood up. Looking Calhoun straight in the eye, Jackson gave his toast in a loud, clear voice.
Our federal union, it must be preserved.
The suspense was over. Calhoun hid his feelings and replied gracefully,
"The Union, next to our liberty, the most dear. May we all remember that it can only be preserved by respecting the rights of the states and by distributing equally the benefits and burdens of the Union."
The split between the president and the vice president widened. Once Jackson had made it clear that he would meet any challenge to the authority of the federal government. Still insisted that the tariff rates be lowered. Urged on by President Jackson himself, Congress undertook to change the tariff of 1828. Congress did remove some of the bad features of the old tariff, but when the new Tariff Act of 1832 set rates which were only a little lower, South Carolina exploded. This time, South Carolina's leaders put their threats into action. A special state convention was called, which declared that the tariff law was nullified, or had no force so far as South Carolina was concerned. The nullifiers, as they were called, spelled out just what they meant.
"No duties enjoined by that law shall be paid or permitted to be paid in the state of South Carolina after the first day of February, 1833.
Furthermore, said the nullifiers, if anyone tried to force them to abide by this law, South Carolina would secede. That is, she would leave the Union. When Jackson heard the news from South Carolina, he said grimly,
If one drop of blood in defiance of the law, I will hang the first man of them I can get my hands on to the first tree I can find.
Jackson wasted no time in writing an official proclamation to the people of South Carolina, in which he said,
You object that the laws in question operate unequally or can be passed. The wisdom of man never yet contrived a system of taxation that would operate with perfect equality. You must perceive that the crisis would recur whenever any law of the United States displeased any of the states, and that we should soon cease to be a nation. To say also that any state may at pleasure secede from the Union is to say that the United States are not a nation. The Union was formed for the benefit of all. It was produced by mutual sacrifices of interest and opinion. There is yet time to show that the descendants of the 1,000 names which adorn the pages of your revolutionary history will not abandon that union for which so many of them fought and bled and died.
Jackson gave his orders.
Provide as many boats and employ as many inspectors as may be necessary for the execution of the law.
Next, he asked Congress for the power to close ports and to seize vessels if necessary. Jackson even hinted that if war came, he himself would take the field and personally lead the troops as Commander-in-Chief of the United States. Before both sides met head-on, however, another actor appeared on stage, Henry Clay, Senator from Kentucky. Clay believed in tariffs, but his nickname was the Great Pacificator because of his skill in working out compromises which would pacify both sides. Led by Henry Clay, Congress passed a new tariff law in 1833, which provided for a gradual lowering of the rates over a period of 10 years. This compromise was satisfactory to many Southerners. In South Carolina, the nullifiers decided to accept the new tariff and repealed their act of nullification of the old one. But South Carolina still insisted on the right of a state to nullify federal laws. To prove this right, South Carolina nullified the so-called Force Bill, just passed by Congress, which authorized the president to use military force to uphold the tariff. Since South Carolina already had agreed to obey the new federal tariff law, Jackson ignored this last gesture of defiance. Thus, the question of state versus federal power was not settled for all time. When it came up again in the 1860s, there was no last-minute compromise. Instead, South Carolina and 10 other states seceded, and a bloody war was fought to preserve the Union. 30 years before, Jackson had realized how important the question could become. He said,
The Union must be preserved, without bloodshed, if this be possible. But it must be preserved at all hazards and at any price.
By his firmness in this belief, Jackson helped to hold the Union together at a danger point in our history. United, this country was able to expand westward to the Pacific and thus gain the strength to meet an even greater test in the 1860s. Since the relation between the states and the federal government would continue to trouble America, it is important to understand the nullification struggle. Here are some key questions to consider.